we have the joy and the opportunity to speak to Pastor Danielle Parish, and she is speaking to us from Spark.Church, and she has a panel of folks gathered that will be able to speak to the realities that we're facing today with the Black Lives Matter moment and the calls for gospel justice and the calls for economic changes and new realities of how to help communities thrive. Pastor Danielle is at the forefront of this conversation with her congregation. They've been thinking about this, talking about it. They've been demonstrating and trying to help the church move forward. And so she's going to be moderating this session. I'm going to kick it over to her.
Well, thank you so much. As John mentioned, I'm Pastor Danielle, and I'm from Spark.Church here in Palo Alto. And I first just want to kind of address the fact that I am a white girl. That's what I want to talk about. I am like one little bit top of the pile, and I want to acknowledge my privilege in this conversation, and that I don't want to center my voice in particular, which is why we're going to have a panelist of Sparkers continue to talk about gospel justice and racial justice in particular. But I also want to be able to share with you what I'm passionate about and what I've been just gifted to be part of in the Spark community as the pastor there. That we started the church about 7 years ago, and we're really grateful to be there and part of this incredible community pursuing what we call gospel justice. So obviously, we are in a season where our brother George Floyd's voice cried out and the world started to listen. This was by far not the first voice that has called out, nor the loudest one even right now, or the most important voice in our entire conversation. It was just the one that, whether it was because people were paying attention as a result of pandemic or what, finally somebody and the globe really started to pay attention. So since then, and since our brother George's death and murder, we have every Sunday at Spark been protesting as a result of leadership of our Sparkers all along the different intersections of El Camino in Palo Alto. Safe for COVID, silent protest, trying to witness to injustice and trying to put a call forth for justice in this world. We've been doing that as part of our Spark community, and the congregation where Spark rents space is a Jewish synagogue. I don't know if there's anything other than a Jewish synagogue. It's a synagogue named Congregation Eitz Chaim in Palo Alto, and their leaders and rabbis and friends of ours have also been coming and demonstrating with us on that corner. We've been really grateful for that. So as a result of that, I think Nicole Dickens, this amazing Sparker of ours and part of the Passion Talk community and leadership, asked us to share a little bit of how we got here and what has shaped our pursuit of gospel justice and what made these protests, as well as lots of others, sort of the natural next step for our community as followers of Jesus. The first thing I'd like to draw your attention to is that when we started Spark.Church 7 years ago, plus now, we created this community based on these 5 values together. The values that drive Spark are love, reputation, reconciliation, rescue, and resurrection. And you can see that those 5 values have further explanations that you can go on our website and look at. But I would just like to let you know that everything that we do at Spark is seen through this lens, seen and measured through the lens of these values. Like, is that something that loves God and loves our neighbor? Is this action that we're taking going to push forward the reputation of God in our community, or will our behaviors detract from the reputation of God in our community? How do we see this as through the ministry of reconciliation that Christ has given us? How do we see this expressed as our participation in that ministry of reconciliation? And believing that we have a God of rescue who's rescued all of us out of our own personal Egypts and sin and death. How are we expressing that rescue into the world? And then how do we express, yes, the incredible, miraculous belief that God can even bring life from the dead? So that is what we gauge everything on. And I would say the first thing that really would be a question as we think about Spark taking certain actions for gospel justice is we would ask, does it meet our value set? And the way that we got these, they weren't just like ideas that we thought, oh, that sounds nice, or really like, Silicon Valley or whatever it might be. We got them from the Bible. So very quickly, as then we kind of give a platform for where we get our ethic of gospel justice and these values living out in our community and in the world, let me take you all the way back to in the beginning. Very much Spark lands on a grand narrative and a large conversation, sort of like 30,000 foot view of the scriptures. And so we try to take everything as a whole. And from the very beginning, we see that God has said, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness. And then God says, that's very good, right? After God has made this, has made all of humanity. So from the very set of the very beginning of the scriptures, we are told that every human being we encounter on the face of this earth is made in the image of God, in the likeness of God, and then we would honor that creation in the other person. So from the very beginning, we honor the divine in one another, we honor the creator in one another, and we start to try our very best to see God's handiwork in the other person. In the garden, then, at the very beginning, as image bearers, we are given the job right away to guard, to keep, to protect. And yet, very quickly, after a sneaky snake incident, as I'm sure you're all aware of, within just a few short verses, short chapters, we have the first death and the first murder, right? This first death, this first murder is a brother against a brother. So from that very point, we would see at Spark, because of how the Bible teaches, that every loss of life taken, every life taken from the hand of a human being to another hand of a human being is fratricide, right? It is brother against brother, brother against sister, sister against sister, that we are seeing siblings take one another's life. From that point, then, in our narrative, after the Abrahamic covenant and the blessing of all nations on earth will be blessed, but also the unique part that says that Abraham, your descendants, will be enslaved for 400 years, we jump forward to the book of Exodus, where God has heard the cries of his people. They don't even know to cry out God's name. They're just crying because of the suffering of slavery. And they cry out to God, and God pushes through and sets them free. So we see at the very beginning of our text, as that holistic move, that God is a God that does not condone slavery, that pushes through to see rescue in this world, and that would rescue and see justice come for his own people. And we would argue also for the Egyptians, who still needed themselves to be set free from this sin of slavery. From the point then of freedom, the Israelites are not just given freedom from slavery, but they are given freedom for a purpose. And the purpose is to join in a covenant. Really, it's set up sort of almost like a marriage covenant with God, to join in this beautiful covenant of Torah, of commands and instructions, where God then creates, yes, systems, societies, a people that will be a kingdom of priests that rule and reign as God is their king, and that God in this will give them these instructions to set up a place where the marginalized are centered. And we can show you thousands of verses where God is talking about his concern for the oppressed. Here's one in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 17 through 19. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, and who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the strangers, providing them food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you were once strangers in the land of Egypt. Right away, God sets the narrative for the Israelites as, remember what it felt like, you yourselves, to be enslaved. Remember what it felt like to be a stranger, and make sure that you don't make anybody else feel that way. So oftentimes in academic literature, these little portions here of the orphan, the widow, and the stranger, this is often referred to as the Holy Trinity. Obviously not the Holy Trinity we speak of as Christians, but it is still these three together, orphans, widows, strangers, popping up over and over and over again in our biblical text. Deuteronomy proceeds forward. You must not distort justice. You must not show partiality in Deuteronomy 16. And this verse, justice and only justice you shall pursue, so that you may live and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Right? This is a covenant that we are engaged with God, that we had promises to keep, that we would pursue justice. And that would be first and foremost in our mind as we create this community that God has called us to. Now, at the foot of Mount Sinai, then, Israel says, yes, we want to do these things. And this is the world that we want to create. And we take on God's instructions, God's commands to create a system and a society that is distinctly different than the ones that we have been part of, and actually quite unique in the entire ancient Near Eastern world. The book Created Equal by Joshua A. Berman sort of tracks through the uniqueness of these commands that God has given Israel. And he says, if there was one truth the ancients held to be self-evident, it was that all men were not created equal. If we maintain today that, in fact, they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, then it's because we have inherited, as part of our cultural heritage, notions of equality that were deeply entrenched in the ancient passages of the Pentateuch. From the very beginning, God has been creating a place, a community, a system that is just and that is concerned with centering those who are marginalized in the society and making sure that they have equal access to justice and to leadership. God looks on the heart, not on the outside. As our narrative then continues, and Sparkers take great pride in continuing to push through this study, we see the prophets calling out these same covenantal promises and agreements that they have made, that the Israelites have made with God. Isaiah at the very beginning, in Isaiah chapter 1, verses 11 and following, and this is just a little bit, says, "What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of burnt offerings, of rams, of fat-fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or lambs of goats." Like, basically, I don't care about your worship. I don't care how nice your songs are. I don't care how good you feel when you sing them. I don't care how powerful it is. When you come appear before me, who asked this from your hand? Trample my courts no more. Bringing offerings is futile, and sense is an abomination to me. Even though you make prayers, I will not listen, because your hands are full of blood. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil from before my eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do good. And how do you do that? You seek justice. You rescue the oppressed. You defend the orphan, and you plead for the widow. This is what we are called to do. The prophets on and on, whether you're looking at Amos and justice flowing down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, or grabbing the Micah 6:8 verse that we see on bumper stickers all around, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. We see over and over again the prophetic response to Israel not fulfilling their covenant is to call them back to the ways of justice, because these are the ways of the Lord our God who brought us up out of Egypt. In fact, I would argue that the prophets are saying over and again that when we neglect our pursuit of justice, we are breaking the covenant and we abandon our prophetic role in the world. And I would like to submit that we have done that today too as the church, that when we have neglected our pursuit of justice, we've broken our covenant promises with God, and we've abandoned and lost our prophetic voice and role in this world. Jesus continues in this prophetic line, doesn't he? Now, I have to say that as we started Spark, one of the things that was a deep shaping of our starting of this community was the fact that my husband, Kevin, and I have spent a lot of time in the Middle East. We've lived in Jerusalem and Israel. We've studied there. We've traveled throughout the Middle East. And the more we studied Jesus in historical, cultural context, the more compelled we became by this good news and gospel and by this prophetic call for justice. I don't want anyone listening to think, oh, they're in California, therefore they're in the Bay Area and they're a little bit Berkeley adjacent, and that's why they have these progressive values or this pursuit of justice. We are not primarily shaped by those values, though of course we're in this context. We are shaped by the biblical call for justice and by the person of Jesus. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus is asked, what is the number one commandment? And we say this every single Sunday at Spark because Jesus says it and we want to follow him. And he says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with everything you've got, with your heart, with all soul, with might, and love your neighbor as yourself." He says the second is like unto it. We see all of the values of Spark expressed in this full commandment. And that first word, "Hear, O Israel," the word "hear" in Hebrew is Shema, and it can mean listen, pay attention, but it also has the connotation of obey. Now, we recognize that we fall short of this all the time, but this is our aim and our goal, to follow the commandments of Jesus and to try to pursue our way through this biblical practice. Jesus over and over again continues to call us to actual action steps in care and concern for the marginalized and the oppressed. And not only does he call us to love our neighbor, but very unique to the person of Jesus, he calls us to even love those we would consider enemies, because when we do so, we are like God who loves all. And Jesus says, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. So a sacrificial call of love, an understanding of what is happening for your sister, for your brother, that is what is pursuing and pushing our call for gospel justice. Of course, Jesus's sort of penultimate expression of all this is in Matthew 25, when he says, whenever you don't care for the hungry, the thirsty, the imprisoned, the sick, the oppressed, you don't care for me. And whenever you do these things, you do care for me. So in all of that, that is sort of the anchor and the girding for how we pursue these things. We see in the life of Jesus that Jesus goes to those on the margins. He listens to those on the margins, learns from those on the margins, advocates for those on the margins, loves those on the margins, invites those on the margins, invites them to lead, invites them to have their voices centered. He invites them to join us and join him in loving all of those on the margins, including ourselves, and building his movement with those on the margins. And so our call really at Spark is, will we follow him? And of course, then pursuing for the rest of our text, we see in the epistles with the Apostle Paul, this incredibly radical statement that in Christ, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, all one in Christ Jesus. We see calls for justice in the book of James. If you really keep the royal law as found in the scripture, that Shema, the love your neighbor and the love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. I don't know right here, racism is showing favoritism. It is systems that are set up that put certain persons, in our context, white male, up at the top of the pile, and then build a system around that. The Bible calls this sin and says that when we do these things, we have shown favoritism and we're convicted by the law as lawbreakers. So for Sparkers, we have seen that the gospel and justice are inseparable. We hear that call of James, who says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, or I would say the prayer and accept Jesus into your heart, but we don't do anything about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. We see that loving our brother and our sister, loving our neighbor, loving those we perceive to be enemies is a call of Christ that should change the world around us and should change our very lives. And it is how we fulfill the gospel. We understand that as we are made in the image of God, descendants of Abraham, heirs to the covenantal promises of God, disciples of Jesus, called to obey and bring about the gospel, we'll ask the question, am I my brother's keeper? Way back to that first fratricide, brother against brother death in Genesis. And the answer we would say is yes. Yes, we are. We are our brothers and our sisters' keeper. The gospel is inseparable from justice. And in fact, I would argue that the gospel, good news, does not happen if justice is not happening. Now, we can have all the theological debates about seeing justice in the world to come. And yes, when we pray, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, that is our anticipated promise. But that should not pull us aside from the good work of gospel justice in this world. So when we pursue justice, we are doing through these lenses. So what now? How do we continue to do this, not just as Spark, but as larger communities? So I would say that our first step is to repent. We must first acknowledge the fact that we have been beneficiaries, participants. The church in particular, the white evangelical church in particular, has much to repent for, and then to start to remember the cloud of witnesses that have come before us, to remember that we are part of this ancient tradition stretching all the way back to Abraham and before, where we are created in the image of God, called to do good things in this world and created for these good works. When we stretch back in this cloud of witnesses, we don't only remember and study the people of the text, we remember those in the early church. The apostate Julian emperor, the apostate Julian, he was the last Roman emperor that was a non-Christian. And he was angry with the Christians. And he said this about the Christian community: nothing has contributed to the progress of the superstition of the Christians as their charity to strangers. The impious Galileans provide not only for their own poor, but for ours as well. Julian blamed Christianity's growth on the generosity and the justice work that Christians in the Galilee were doing. And then to leap way forward, we can skip several 2,000 years of history, we'll find that in our own American church history, there have been Christian fathers and mothers who have made justice work inseparable with the proclamation of the good news of Jesus Christ. Charles Finney declared in 1934 in his sermon that, it should be 1834, that he could not recognize men as Christians if they trafficked in the bodies and souls of fellow men. And he refused as early as 1833 to allow slaveholders to commune in his church, saying, I do not baptize slavery by some soft Christian name if I call it a sin, and its perpetrators cannot be fit subjects for Christian communion and fellowship. This was in the early 1800s. We have to remember Sojourner Truth, who called out the need to see the slaveholders set free as well as the slave. Lucretia Mott in the late 1700s and 1800s, who said, I have no idea of submitting tamely to injustice inflicted either on me or on the slave. I will oppose it with all the moral powers with which I am endowed. I am no advocate of passivity. Lucretia Mott, Sarah and Angelica Grimke, who said that this slavery sin is the sin which the church is fostering in her bosom in 1836. This is leprosy over which she is casting the mantle of charity to hide, if possible, the putrefying sores. Can you any longer, with your eyes fixed upon the cross of Christ, plant your foot on his injured representative and sanction and sanctify this heart-breaking and soul-destroying system? We have brothers and sisters over and over again in our family of Christ who've called out and demanded that the proclamation of Jesus means equal justice for all. We have brothers and sisters who laid down their lives for the Jews who are being assassinated and annihilated in Germany. We have in our own most recent history civil rights heroes, John Lewis, Martin Luther King, and so many others who marched and said that this is the love of God. This is the love that transforms. This is how we see the beloved community that Christ had talked about. So we remember our roots. And that's one of the ways that we can remember and pursue this gospel justice. We listen. At Spark, we have done so much trying to listen, trying to study and understand, trying to hear different speakers coming on in. We have spent time with our Jewish brothers and sisters, our Muslim brothers and sisters, listening to how they have been harmed by people who've claimed the name of Jesus. And we've tried to see reconciliation work happen in these spaces. So as we've listened and learned and studied over and over and over again, whether it's on behalf of the refugee or those incarcerated in our systems here in the prison, school to prison pipeline, or whether it is listening to children at the border, we are listening and trying to learn, and then we call out injustice. Now, I grew up in a home where I was told not to discuss religion or politics with strangers, which was why I became a pastor and I was a poli-sci major in college. So I understand that when we talk about some of these things, for some of us, we hear politics. I want to let you know, I don't hear politics. I hear justice. I don't think this is a Democrat or Republican issue, and it is not my problem if a political party starts to grab one of these issues and try to make it partisan. I am called by the gospel and the commands of Jesus to pursue justice. This is a picture of my friend, Pastor Marcus, who will be on our panel in just a few moments with his father. And I love this shirt. Justice ain't political, it's biblical. And then all of the Bible verses on the back. Maybe we all just need to start wearing this and reminding ourselves around. This is a fantastic tweet from Marcus Haley. Maybe some of you follow him on Twitter. He says, is this a social justice church? Is Spark a social justice church? To me, that's like saying, is this a book library or a food grocery store? We are a church. And because we follow Christ, we are called, among other things, to pursue justice. So that's what we try to do at Spark. We try to pursue justice, whether it is trying to show solidarity for those killed worshiping at a Bible study, whether it is to show solidarity for those who are being discriminated against because of their faith, or those who are being held out in difficult situations as a result of war or climate change or whatever it is, and unable to find refuge, wherever it might be, we are going to find ourselves standing there. So what I want to encourage us all to do is to embrace discomfort and to get brave. This is not easy. It is hard work, and we will at times make giant mistakes. We will want to cower in fear, but we want to call you to this good work because we believe it is the way of Jesus. And then once we have done these things, we're going to encourage everybody to repeat it again and again and again. In Pirkei Avot, the saying of the fathers, an early rabbinic writing from the 2nd century CE, it says this: "You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it." You aren't obligated to solve all of the social ills or to solve every justice challenge that we have in our community, but you're not free to desist from it either. We are called to do these things because Jesus himself said, "If you love me, keep my commands." And we want to keep Jesus's commands. So that's what we do at Spark. We are striving, all of us, from myself and everyone else, to inspire people to live the way of Jesus, to see the world through this lens of magnificent love on display for us through the Father's love for the Son and through the Father's love for the world. So that is what we are trying to do. But I want to let you know that as we now are going to move in a few moments to question and response, this is not something I do on my own. This is not something I do because I think it's a good idea. It is something I do with a community of people. And so in a few moments, I'll introduce you to our panelists who are board members and pastors at Spark and who help us do all this good work. And we're going to be asking them a few questions as we go through that process. Okay? Does that sound good? So I'll invite the board up here in just a moment, our panel, and we'll get ready. All right, John, I think I'll turn it over to you for a moment and we'll get the panelists up. And panelists, if you would like to show us your video screens here, then we can start to share your photos here. Thank you, everyone. All right, John, what's the best way to make this work, do you think?
Yeah, the best way is, so when we get questions that come in, and Pastor Danielle, you did an amazing job just taking us to church. There's so many comments on all the threads, but let's stay in that mindset. Let's stay in church and really dig into what God is just testifying through your congregation too. And so if you know somebody has a story and there's a question that relates to them, I would just say, for you, if you'd like to toss it over to them, I think that would be a great call. I don't know.
So then what I'd like to ask the panelists to do, hi all, hi friends. I would like you guys to state your name, maybe what your role has been at Spark, and how you got started on your own journey of pursuing gospel justice, if it's something that's relatively new to you in regard with your practice of your faith, or how you've been pursuing, when did that start for you? How did it start for you? That would be my first question. So shall we start? Raise your hand if you want to be first. All right, Stacy, go ahead.
So hi, everyone. My name's Stacy Arevalo. I'm a founding member and a board member at Spark.Church. I first got into this lifestyle of following Jesus and being oriented to gospel justice really my junior year of college. In the same quarter as I was learning about injustice in our public education system, I started going to church again. And it was impossible to talk about racial justice in my class at UCLA without also hearing God's response to that in sermons, even at the Southern Baptist church that I was attending at the time. It was impossible to not see how God and our text has an answer to all of the injustices that I was learning about in our public education system. And so that quarter, I rededicated my life to Christ, and I decided to become a high school teacher, making sure that students of color and students who have been marginalized have access to higher education. So for me, those things are so deeply intertwined that I can't imagine following Jesus without pursuing justice, specifically racial justice in our country. And I can't imagine being a teacher in the context that I am without having Jesus to show me the way and to give me a community of people who are striving for a world that looks very different from the world today.
Thank you, Stacy. Who else would like to introduce themselves? Go ahead, Tom.
So I'm relatively new to justice, probably about 5 years old now. And in some respects, it's a little sad and it makes me feel a little ashamed because justice, as Danielle was saying, is just so critical. It is a part of Jesus's message. If you look in Luke 4, Jesus's first real sermon where there's content, he says he came to preach good news to the poor. And the poor wasn't just those who are economically disadvantaged, but people who were on the margins, people who were oppressed, people that didn't have privilege. And so I went to a church, and it's a good church. I went to a white evangelical church. We emphasize Matthew 28, 19, and 20. Let's make disciples. And that is good. We should. And so that's a lot of evangelism. We talked a lot about being filled with the Spirit, love and kindness and patience. All that is good. But justice was lacking, and it's just critical that we have to have it. So fortunately for me, I have people that speak into my life. And so you see Stacy that just spoke, or Marcus who just spoke, and so many other people who have told me their stories. And if you hear these stories, you realize that there is something wrong in America. There really is. It's racism, it's sexism, it's anti-Semitism. And I feel, as a person of faith, it is my moral obligation to stand up and say something.
Pastor Danielle, you're on mute. Oh, no, go ahead, Marcus.
Thank you. Pastor Marcus, go ahead.
Real fast. I won't go real fast. Short of it is, I came to Jesus about, it'll be 20 years. Jesus, wow, coming to know Jesus in October. And I kind of went through the typical evangelical phase and, staunch kind of party line. However, what also I could never escape the fact that I was Black. And it always felt subtly that there was aspects of the culture that were kind of asking me to forget or lay aside being Black in my experience. And that never sat well with me. It never sat well with me. And there's also a little bit of a balance because of the way it was presented in the political evangelical culture. It was presented in the ways being in these particular circles makes you a sellout, and that you're it feels like you're caught between two worlds. And as far as justice goes, you just keep pushing. And I oftentimes say that really 2008 was a pivotal moment for me. As far as making some true qualitative decisions. And it really wasn't the election of Barack Obama. It was actually the passing of Prop 8 in California. And it wasn't so much as that I was a party line with same-sex marriage, but part of me just on a real rational, let me separate it, being a church for a second, was I don't understand why we as a church, as an organization, went so hard for a law that was between two consenting adults, and the government just wants to acknowledge it. I literally it just never kind of sat well with me. And then you saw the picture with my father, that shirt. Pops was a typical teenager in the late 60s, so he was almost Black Panther-ish, but not Black Panther. But he would tell us stories about riding in the back of the bus when he was 5 years old, and his experiences, and my maternal grandfather would tell me stories. Mom would tell me particular stories too. Part of the questioning also came from the fact that they always had us reading books about Black history. So I never, except something inside of me, and I definitely think it was Jesus, could never separate the justice and radicalism, and certain teachings, because just as we mentioned, Dr. King, very interesting. Even as I got older, I'm the Dr. King that I was kind of told about, and the Dr. King who gets celebrated is different. It's just different, and so but definitely he was a man driven by his faith, and so so those are kind of what as poured into justice. And in Spark, opportune time, opportune place, and hey, love them. And so definitely fit with that vibe.
Fantastic. Thank you. Pastor Kevin, would you like to go next, or Pamela?
I think I heard my name,
Okay,
unless
go
Pamela
ahead.
wants to go. I mean, it's hard to answer a question that's already been answered for you. I mean, I would echo and plus one what everyone else has said. I guess the only other things that I'll add to that is that I have two philosophies, I suppose, that really radically transformed my faith journey. One was that all truth is God's truth. And I don't remember where I picked that up from, but many years ago, that radically shifted what I was supposed to learn and what I was not supposed to learn when you grow up in more fundamentalist circles. So when you learn that all truth is God's truth, then there's nothing that you have to be concerned about learning if you want to discover who God is. And then the second philosophy that dovetails with that I picked up a couple years later was that the opposite of fear is not courage, but curiosity. And so once you accept that philosophy, that if you are concerned that racial justice or Black Lives Matter or any of these things, that phrases and words that people use, evokes within you a concern or a fear about what's going on in our socio-political context, the human tendency is to lean into protecting my emotional fear, like the thing that I'm concerned about. But if you recognize that the opposite of fear is not courage, and now I just got to dig down stronger into the thing that I already believe, which is confirmation bias and all sorts of psychological pitfalls. Once you accept that curiosity is actually the answer, then it allows you the freedom to dig everywhere. And what I have found, I will speak for myself, but I think this is true for all of humanity, because that's just my general philosophy, is I think we're all pretty ignorant. And our objective should be to learn. Seek first to understand. And I think too often, most people, and especially Christians who know God, are very quick to seek to be understood first, without stopping to seek first to understand. What is Black Lives Matter? What is racial justice? Tell me what all of this is going, and then you start learning. And so that's what leads us to the reading, studying, listening, and then everything else that Pastor Danielle presented. And then of course, my co-panelists have already mentioned. So those will just be two additional pieces that would add to the conversation.
Thank you, Pastor Kevin. Pamela? We can't quite hear you, Pamela. I don't know if you can. She's almost with us. Poor Pamela. Oh, it's so fun, this tech. If we were in a room, we'd be able to hear you.
Yeah, because her Zoom is unmuted, it's probably how her audio is wired on whatever device that she's using. So I'm not sure.
We'll give you a minute, Pamela, and see if you're able to figure out the audio situation. We love you. We can't wait to hear from you. Okay, so panelists, while we're waiting for Pamela to join us with her audio, can I ask you a question? Is there a distinction, or how would you respond to the distinction between racial reconciliation and racial justice? And I think that those are two different framings, and maybe, I guess what I am wondering about how you live out what you might do on an individual level versus what you also understand us needing to do either on a systems level or with an organizational level at Spark, or those types of things. That makes sense. How do you guys try to toggle between reconciliation and justice, particularly around the idea of race?
Who wants to go? I would, if you were to do some sort of categorization, justice is the overall umbrella of what we might think about of our work. Reconciliation, reform, conversations, all that stuff falls under that umbrella. How different people engage with this particular topic could all fall under the umbrella of justice, because justice is that kind of all-encompassing term. Biblically, justice could also mean charity. So you're giving a strong sense of charity to one another, which means that you are welcoming their ideas and their thoughts, and your graciousness to one another, etc. And then reconciliation, of course, is to bring things back together, that which is broken. So reconciliation, in my mind, has a much more biblical thematic idea to it. That which was broken, again, going all the way back to Genesis. And then justice, I mean, Danielle already said it all. Justice is the system that we want to establish. So.
I think the reason why I wanted to ask that is because I think sometimes, Pamela, are you with us? Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so please introduce yourself and then tell us about how and when you started forming your pursuit of gospel justice, and particularly within relationship of the church as well with your faith.
So I am also a founding member and part of the board and part of the prayer team and a lot of other things at Spark. My journey for gospel justice and racial justice is there is no beginning. It's a life journey. This isn't something that was offered by choice. This is something that's just part of who I am and part of my family. It's been with dealing with the challenges that I've seen my parents deal with and advocate for me as I was growing up, and as a Black woman dealing with different biases and struggles for people to see me for who I am instead of, the color of my skin. And also as a parent, advocating for not just my kids, but all kids to be treated fairly, to be understood for who they are and the inner person that they are. So, and I also connect with, other communities that are also faced with racial treatment and biases. The thing that resonates, though, for me is being a part of Spark, a church that's willing and open to listening, learning, and understanding the challenges of all people. That's not the case in many of the places that I have gone to throughout my Christian life. And so it means a tremendous amount to be able to worship with a body that I can bring my whole self. And I can talk about all of the challenges that I have as a Black person in the Black community. And I can also use that to understand others within the congregation who have similar challenges. One of the things that I found out as we had our book club discussions and just the conversations, the many conversations that we've had, is that we have so much more in common than we have that's different. And so embracing those challenges and being able to stand together as a congregation and as a team has really been a turning point, I can say, in my Christian walk and having a body like this. So it means a great deal.
Thank you all for sharing. I am reflecting on the responses that you all gave and how beautiful and fascinating it is that so many Christians, non-Black Christians or Christians that are not persons of color, perceive this as optional or something that, I kind of got into it like it's like a Christian fad at some point. Like I used to go to this kind of church, but now I'm going to this kind of church and maybe I'll go. Whereas I think Pamela and Marcus both beautifully illustrated, if you are born a minority in our culture, it is not something you get to choose. You don't get to decide someday that you might be concerned about justice or racial justice or racial reconciliation. It is a calling that you are enlisted into right away as a result of of the way that our society is functioning and working. So I just call out, even the question has so much privilege behind it, right? Like, when was it something you became awakened to or decided to pursue or decided would be part of your walk with Christ? And that typically, not always, but often can come from people for whom it's just not been a pressure point or an examined need in their life to have to find a church or find a faith community or a body of believers in which these realities can be talked about, prayed about, and tackled in those communities. So actually, it's one of the questions that's come through. It's, while I agree that justice is biblical, our culture seems to have unfortunately turned it into something that's political. So what do you think is a good starting point for conversations to have with Christians who don't put the two and two together, right? That justice is actually a biblical issue and not a political one. And I'll just say first, like, read the Bible. Like, I don't know but like, if you read it, chronologically over cover to cover, and you're doing so with some study, a guide, you can find these things right away. But maybe there's some of our favorite resources out there that we could kind of toss out. I'd love to hear from the panel. What first steps would you give somebody who's trying to have that conversation with that brother or sister in Christ, but who's not yet made the connection that the pursuit of justice is good news, right? That is the proclamation of the gospel as we proclaim Christ. Who would like to go first? Kevin, are you nodding? You have some resources you'd recommend? Go ahead.
You know me. I'm
ready. Yeah.
I'm going to say something that I think is going to possibly vote me off the island.
We're already there.
But you mentioned, read the Bible. So that's step one. But there's also another factor. I have this blog post, podcast idea in my head. What's the number one context that nobody ever talks about in Bible college and in seminary? And it's the most important context when it comes to interpreting these passages and interpreting Jesus. So if you take a hermeneutics class, you're going to learn about cultural context, historical context, linguistic context, grammatical context. You're going to learn about all that context. And the one thing I was never taught in seminary is that I have a context. My particular lens that I bring to the Bible is also shaping how I view the text and what it is saying and what it means. And nobody has ever taught me that. That was something that I had to pick up reading literary scholars and just other philosophers and stuff like that. And once you recognize that, so if somebody has a commitment to Jesus, I would actually ask the question, who is this Jesus and what does that Jesus stand for? Because oftentimes we can actually have a commitment to something other than Jesus and then put the Jesus and Christian label on it. You can actually have a commitment to a political party or to a particular ideology, and then you put Jesus as the label on that. And you're not actually worshiping or following the historical person of Yeshua, ben Yosef of Nazareth. You're actually worshiping your own idea. It's what's called totemism in sociology, that you erect a pole that is a representation of your traits and values, the things that you find worthy, and then you worship. It's basically self-idolatry. And so when I have conversations, or if I were to ever have a conversation with somebody who says that they're committed to Jesus, I would actually want to ask, is it really Jesus? And again, back to the curiosity question, this is why what we have found ourselves in is to do the historical work and ask the question, who really was this person that I'm claiming to follow? What was that context? And to recognize that even my context might color how I read. And so I have to do the work to make sure that I lay that down and ask the question, what did all of this mean to Jesus, to the early disciples, et cetera, et cetera. So there's obviously a lot more to that, but I'll offer that
that's fantastic, because I do think so much of what has gotten the non-Black and members of Spark to the place where they are ready to recognize their own biases, their own participations in systems of privilege, and their own ways that they've, read the text with these biases has been the historical cultural study. It's been going and hiking in Israel and trying to go, oh, well, that, how do these things work and function? It's been trying our very best to get back and hear it as the ancients heard it at that time. That has really opened people up. I would suggest, like, members who have not particularly experienced these systemic injustices, but has opened themselves up to a more contextual reading, historically contextual reading of Jesus's words, of Moses's words, and others. So appreciate that. Anyone else want to chime in on that? Like, what's a good starting point for the Christian that just says, I think this is political and not biblical?
Yeah. I would encourage them that it's both. It is also political. And I think we're called to have an influence at a political realm. Pastor Kevin will often say that political, however, does not mean partisan. So the word political in our context often means Democrat or Republican, progressive, liberal, or conservative. And we're not talking about that binary, but we are hoping to impact the politics and the structures of our earth right now, on earth as it is in heaven. That's literally in the prayer that Jesus tells us to pray. And so I would want to encourage people to not be afraid of being political. I would encourage people that in the same ways that many churches and many people from pulpits preach that we should vote a certain way, that the church is already very political in this country, and that we have the opportunity to show other Christians and to show non-Christians that political can mean something very different than it has historically in the US. I also see it as just so essential to what we're called to do as Christians, that, like, we'll sing "My life is not my own," and we preach that our money is not our own. Our privilege is not our own. How can we spend our lives? How can we spend our money? How can we spend our privilege to help shape this upside down kingdom that Jesus paints for us so beautifully in the Gospels? Brittany Packnett Cunningham, who's a Christian Black activist and educator, wrote a whole essay on spend your privilege. And to me, it was so Christian. And when I shared it with non-Christian friends, it was mind-boggling to them. They did not have that framework. And so I think that Christians have a very unique and very powerful value set already to do immense work in this field. I've had conversations all week as we're getting ready for the school year with my colleagues, most of whom are not Christian and don't come from that background. And some of the conversations around racial justice in our classrooms and our school are quite stilted because we don't share that same context necessarily of my life is not my own. I want to sacrifice for the greater good. And so I would like our church to see Christians standing up. I like our society to see the church standing up and really using these values, this worldview that Jesus has given us, that the text has given us, that God has given us, to apply that to our political context right now.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Pamela, did you want to contribute?
Yeah, I would add to that that there's a requirement to come with a willingness to release some of the ideas and some of the things that you hold to be true. Misinformation and not understanding the context in which something happens colors our views in a lot of ways. And when you step forward, you need to be able to release a lot of that. There's some decomposition required in order to rebuild and to really learn and to understand. So just as Stacy said, there's oftentimes that you have to have conversations and dismiss some of the what you see as your privilege and reach out to understand, to get a better understanding of things that you just don't know about. So
thank you. Thanks, Pamela. That's great. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
So what I would add is I think there's this continuum where we need to go from being aware to being an ally to being an advocate. And so if you talk about new people who are just kind of like beginning to ask these questions, and I do this all the time with my white friends, there's a real ignorance. There's a real disbelief that there actually is racism in America. They don't see it, and they're good people. They just don't see it. They believe in meritocracy and individualism. And if you work hard and you really persevere, you will succeed. And there's a lot of truth in that, but there is obviously, well, I say obviously, but there are systems that are not helpful, that harm and hurt people of color, that they don't have the same ability necessarily to achieve what a white person is because of the systems that are there. So to your question, what should happen? I think it's about learning and reading and hearing from other voices besides what you have been hearing. Whether it's Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow, that'd be a great book. Jamar Tisby, The Complicity, talking about the color of compromise and how racism has been in the church here in America from the very beginning. And if you haven't read it, it's stunning and amazing and true. And so I think for many people, it's just getting that first step to recognize when our friends of color say there's racism, we need to get enough facts so we know they're not crazy. There is racism, but we need to study and get through that awareness phase to actually begin to engage in helping to stop it, to become anti-racist.
Thank you, Tom. That's great. We have a couple of other questions coming in, and I just wanted to, I think we have time for a few more. So one is the question of like, how do we see the modern white evangelical church continuing to participate in systemic racism? And then what specifically would we be repenting for as that church? What is that call? And then the other question is like, since the Civil Rights Act and Fair Housing Act and others that have restored the legal rights of Black Americans, what systemic racism remains that needs to be legislatively overcome? So those are two questions that have come in, and we can probably address a few of those if you would like. I think just a quick note is, Tom, what you've already said is that there are some books and resources that are out there that follow this through. So at Spark, we didn't just all of a sudden, start to try to convince our congregation to take justice action seriously. We studied. We read The New Jim Crow together by Michelle Alexander. We did racial reconciliation, racial justice conversations that were hard and where people had to make mistakes and people had to forgive and apologize and all of the things in between. There's been so much hard work that got us to places of these conversations, having Jamar Tisby come, Austin Channing Brown come, all of those points. I would just say there's a temptation for, at least I found within the Caucasian and white community, to either deny that it is happening or only believe that it is happening if it's happened to a Black person that we know, right? Like, so it's only if it's close to me somehow that then it is legitimized. And I hope that we are able to move to a place where, as Pastor Kevin said, like sort of a holy curiosity and a willingness to step into empathy and compassionate listening and really try to understand what has been happening, whether or not it's happening to somebody that we know, right? For those of us who've had the experience and privilege and joy of being part of a more diverse community, we've been able to see systemic racism, microaggressions, macroaggressions up close and personal to the people we love, to the people we're married to the people that are our children. But it shouldn't take that for Christians, brothers and sisters, to believe that it is happening. We shouldn't have to witness it personally. We can believe what our brothers and sisters are saying. And to that end, then, as George Floyd cries out, as Breonna Taylor cries out, as so many have cried out that we have seen their lives taken, this is something that we have witnessed, and we don't need to call it into question as to whether or not it's happening, or whether or not, if you're looking for an example of systemic racism, then there it is, right? That is still something that needs to be addressed. Or as we talk about the Voting Rights Act and everything else, that we're seeing systemic oppression of Black and brown members of our society and marginalization of their votes and everything else in 1,000 other ways. But if somebody else wants to chime in here of the ways that we might be able to start to, like maybe we just take on the church one. What is something that the church has done that needs repenting of?
There's been so much happening in our world, and there's so many churches that I have gone to that have said nothing. They've been silent as, people of color have died. And so in terms of my hope and prayer is that these churches say something, they step up and not be complicit in the problem. So are they doing anything? No, that's the problem. They're not speaking up and helping to recognize the problem.
I would add to that, Tom, that understanding that this is a long-term thing. This is not a quick fix. It's not something that you can add to your FY20 or FY21 plan and check a box. It's something that you have to stand up and commit to and make a part of who you are, and be in it and involved in it for the long term. It has to be ingrained in part of the nature of your church.
One thing I would like to add is it's interesting that we bring up that particular legislation passing of 19 Civil Rights 1964 Act, because I would argue that who's benefited greatly from it. I think that I find it interesting that the challenges to things like affirmative action, or the challenges to those laws, begin to happen right after the first recipients begin to establish some type of base. And then you have these attacks, but you have these attacks for people who are just now getting their footing, whereas other groups, like there are other groups of Americans who came in shortly after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, who really hit the ground running, who could choose where they got to live, who weren't like systematically held down from things like redlining. And then you could look at you could move to areas, and you could move to areas and then look at the outside area and go, oh, what's wrong with them? Why don't they just get up and move? And not understanding that the systems, that's systematic. Like, I don't think people understand. Folks don't choose to live in rough neighborhoods. Like 9 times out of 10, they want to get out. But they don't choose that. I also would say, on a very basic level, just ask yourself like a real kind of common sensey question. If enough Black people, and I can only speak from the Black context, of a certain age, say, hey, when I was 11, 12, or 13, I was walking down the street or I experienced police brutality. And they're Christians and they're trying to move it. At least ask yourself that question, like, why would they say that, and what's their visceral reaction? And on another note, just on a practical matter, when's the last time you saw Black people in America on the wrong side of history? Just on a practical note, just on some real, slavery, civil rights, just the wage gap, just when was the last time you saw Black people? We was real wrong about that. Just on some basic stuff. And this is coming from churches that have church communities that typically actually have a lot of the main kind of conservative values, that they actually may be pro-life. Actually, many are conservative when it comes to traditional stances of marriage, and yet there's a flexibility to engage in the humanity of your brother and sister. So if you have people who can kind of agree with you on some of the basic moral points, and you stop at, hey, you don't want to be beat up by the police, you don't want to be dehumanized, like even within the context of American evangelicalism, like let's think about it. Black people really just started getting access to mainstream evangelical seminaries like 40, 50 years ago. The Christian high school movement, like that didn't start because Christians in 1945 or 1930 were like, hey, let's start a Christian education. Brown versus Board of Education was passed and Christian private schools took off. Think about that. I mean, just let's check our history for a minute. Like Brown versus Board of Education. Hey, let's have Black people go to their neighborhood schools and integrate. Oh, we want Christian private schools now? What? So examine your history. If when we say that and we look at how these systems have been set in place, unfortunately by church, by our culture.
Thank you, Pastor Marcus. That's great. Go ahead, Stacy.
Yeah, I would like to encourage any people in the white evangelical tradition who are not sure whether systemic racism exists or if the church plays any role in it to follow the greatest command, which is to love God and love your neighbor. And then if you say, well, all my neighbors are white, that proves the point. Why are all of your neighbors white? Because of systemic racism. If you live in a white suburb, that's because of systemic racism. If your life is not proximate to people of color, to Black people, to people who are lower income than you or poor even, or refugees or asylum seekers or recent immigrants, it's because of systemic racism and structural economic inequality that you are not living life with the full breadth of the people who actually live in this country. And so I would encourage you to examine some of your life decisions and the way that privilege has allowed you to build this life for yourself where you're very separated from people, so that when you love your neighbor, you're loving people who look and believe very similarly to you.
Thank you. I think there's one question, and it's directed to Stacy, I think because of your beautiful job, but I think it's for everyone too. How do we help the next generation, right, and Gen X and beyond, who are losing interest in church with a little c even, because of their passions for justice in particular are not found and supported by the church overall? Like, how do we try to continue to help that generation coming in? And I think then I'm going to dovetail that with another question I have for all of you, which is that I would like to ask you, all of you, we've all been participating for some time, not just only the last 10, 11 weeks, but for several years in various protests for social justice or change or issues of oppression, whether it was refugees or DACA recipients or the Muslim travel ban and children at the border and Black Lives Matter. When we have participated in those protests, you as individuals or us as Spark, as a corporation, as the church, what happens for you spiritually when you protest, or when you see your Christian brothers and sisters protesting alongside of you? How does that impact you as an individual? And then, and I would argue, at least in part, I think that's one of the things that that has helped Spark shine a light in our community and helped find people who are also passionate about justice and about the things that are of God's heart. They've found us because they've seen us out there over and over and over again every weekend at that corner. So that's been one of the ways I think that we've attracted people who are like-minded and trying to pursue God's heart for justice. But so the question is, like, how do you find ourselves attracting and connecting with the generation to come when they don't see justice on display in the church? And then what happens for you spiritually when you protest or when you see your brothers and sisters protesting alongside you?
So first, for the first question about reinvigorating younger people's interest in the church, religion, all of those things, the trite answer is just live out your values, and they'll be curious about why you do something. My students know that every Sunday this summer, I've stood out on El Camino with people from my church and some of my coworkers who are very much not Christian, but who were interested. And they know that that's just something that I do every Sunday. And they go, your church does that? And they ask a lot of questions. I would recommend doing a justice study, just going through the Bible, reading all those verses on Marcus's dad's shirt and figuring out, what does this mean for us today? And also a little plug that on social media, there are some extremely brilliant and engaging Black Christians who are all over the place, making classes, tweeting out prayers. That has honestly been like my morning devotional sometimes, is looking up some of these prayers and meditations that Black Christians have been posting that really speak to this intersection of racial justice and gospel justice.
And I'd just like to add, your point there is that sometimes, I think part of what I've heard you say is that sometimes we perceive the monolith of the church as to not having been very involved in justice, when historically, this is why I spent so much time in the talk, historically, we have ancestors who've been fighting for justice, for abolition of slavery, for equal rights for women, for all of that, for 3,000 years. It's part of our biblical text, and it's part of our continuation as we've studied through. So sometimes we perceive that there is silence in the church because we're not listening to other voices than our own, right? But when we start to center Black leaders, persons of color within the church, and whether it's through, Twitter or Facebook or social media, or through the books that Spark has studied, definitely shout out to go on Spark's Gospel Justice page and go to the racial justice hashtag, and you will see all of Pastor Kevin's notes on the books made available for everybody and all of those studies. So I think sometimes it's simply that we've not looked for it, but it is there, and it's part of our faith tradition. It's not a new thing. It's not a progressive moment. I think oftentimes of our brothers and sisters of 200 years ago who were fighting this good fight, saying what still sounds radical today and thinking, how have they not gained more progress in 200 years? We still have so much more to go, particularly within the church. So somebody else want to jump in with the question from previous?
One of the ways I would just like to answer that question, along with Stacy, is that I think that young people also like this authenticity. I can say that, they genuinely, they know when you're kind of like about it. And recently as a job I started at a school as a mental health counseling role, the staff it's really weird being the older person on staff at 40. You're like 41, 42. You're like, wait, how did this occur? But watching, there are younger, like people who are just 10 years younger or 12 years younger that are fired up, and they're hungry. So for them, when they, I don't know, I've told them, oh yeah, my church, we on El Camino every weekend, and maybe there were some kids that when I was youth pastoring they're around that same age, were those kids. So they're like, oh wait, churches do this. So I think actually inviting them into the process, because in my observation, I think that this narrative of Jesus only caring about, or the evangelical, the loud voice, because I can't say it's all the evangelical church, this loud voice only stopping at abortion and like sexual expression. Well, to me, it's a limited gospel, because then it shuts it down. So I think that don't be afraid to holler at them about it, because I think that they are more open than you think, but they also need that, that realness, which is, hey, I care about this, or just be like, I don't know how to engage with this. So like learn from younger people as well, in my observation. And I was gonna say, and just to follow up to answer that question, protesting with Spark is really, as far as it's transformative, because you really do, you're out there, and I had a really unfortunate incident last week where it was racism, like to the worst kind. I was like, oh, like we're experiencing this, but it's interesting to be able to draw on, like, oh, this is something that like Jesus like really experiences. Is blessed are you, like when you're persecuted on behalf of me and we're pursuing righteousness. So there are times when the teaching comes alive, and so that's really unique in that sense. So I definitely feel connected, because we are also connected with a synagogue, and again that reconciliation, that value, and we're pursuing it together. So I definitely feel Jesus in that, in those moments.
So I would add to that, definitely, we just need to stay engaged. Jesus didn't hang out in the synagogue. Or not the synagogue. He didn't. He was out and about talking to people and listening to people. So the important part is the engagement, because we are the church. And if we can connect to the younger generation and give a voice to what we're thinking, but also, as Marcus is saying, listen to what the challenges, the ideas, the influences are of the next generation, it's all about building relationships. People come to a church because there's an established relationship or an established value. So keeping that channel open and being involved in some way. And as far as the protest is concerned, the protest is a way of having your voice be heard, whether it's standing on the corner in silent protest, or it's being a part of a march, or it's making statements on social media, or it's being involved in some kind of training. We have to find ways of making sure that our voices are heard through all channels. So for me, just seeing the participation and the solidarity of all of the Sparkers that are out there week after week, and for those Sparkers who are not there but that are participating in other forms and other methods of support. And whether it's being a part of a book club, hosting a book club in your home and connecting to people that way, or being out there on the corner Sunday after Sunday, all of it counts. All of it counts. We have to all find a way that we can engage and impact in our sphere of influence, and sometimes stepping outside of those spheres to, stand up and be heard.
Thank you.
So I would add that, yes, an affirmation to everything that everybody said. Just like people make divisions and walls of separation between groups and ethnic peoples, the very walls of separation that the church has been called to tear down, so too do we make those same walls between generations. And just as much as we suffer from racism, we also suffer from generational chauvinism. All the old people don't know what they're talking about because I'm new and innovative, and all the young people are just too stupid or young or immature. And that is also another bias and prejudice that I believe that the movement of Jesus calls us to really take to task in a serious way. So my daughter's telling me not to say stupid, so I do apologize for that. So in direct answer to the question or response to the question, how do you get youth to engage, I think part of it again is to take a look at our own biases and our own prejudices against youth. I think especially within the church, when we have a very strong pedagogical philosophy that once I now have come to know really good theology, it's my job to teach that theology to the younger generation, when in reality, the dynamics of understanding theology actually come from a dual dialectic listening of what God is doing in this generation. Just like God was doing something in my generation and the older people, I was trying to encourage them to, hey, come on, let's get along with what God is doing here. Now that I'm older, I should not repeat that same cycle, and to recognize that the younger people also do have the Spirit of God within them. And not any in less measure because they are younger. And so I would also, in addition to everything that everyone else has said, add to that a perspective shift for how we deal with generations, very similar to how we deal with the divisions in racial and ethnic boundaries.
What I would add is that I have such great hope for the young generation. I know the older generation, and I know how our minds are pretty fixed and we don't want to change. And when I see what young people do and what they care about and how they are energized to make change, it excites me. It really does. And as Kevin was saying, everybody's made in the image of God. Right now, we're in a period of this pandemic, and we really can't do church inside a building. So when we go to things like protests and we're wearing our masks, in many respects, we're doing church together, which is really exciting because we're doing God's work. We're bringing good news to the poor. We're bringing good news to the oppressed. I think that is attractive to young people. And maybe for those of us who's older, and I'll include myself in that category, maybe we need to change our styles a little bit, because the younger people are already doing church and maybe we just need to join them and help them learn more. Just a thought.
Yeah, I would capitalize on that. What you were saying and what Stacy's original response was, when you live this way, we don't I don't think we've understood the word discipleship in the appropriate way. We think of discipleship as a class that you take, or we think of discipleship as an activity that, okay, now I'm discipling. But Stacy and Tom, you're saying the same thing. I've nailed it. Discipleship isn't any of those things. Discipleship is how you live in relationship with other people. That's, and as pithy and as trite, as cliche as it is, not trite, but pithy and cliche, it is caught more than it is taught. As you live and as you behave. And what we're doing, what I love about the protests that I see you guys doing, is that there are all the children out there as well. This is normal. This is what we do. This is what it means to be a follower of Jesus. You don't have to teach that to them. Just you live that way, and they absorb it and understand it.
I think, the beginning of the Isaiah verse that we talked about, that I talked about at the very beginning of all of this, it's that justice is worship, right? When you articulate and live out a pursuit of justice, you are demonstrating your worship for God. And God is not interested in our prayers or our songs or offerings until we have lived out justice as worship. And Abraham Joshua Heschel talked about when he marched with Martin Luther King Jr., that he prayed with his feet. Right. So when we're out there every Sunday protesting, or at a variety of the other protests that we've been part of, we've asked the question often, because some of us are new to this type of social justice and action. Some of us have never done anything like this before. And this is the very first time and the very first church community that we've ever been part of that has sort of said, hey, we're all going to go stand on the corner and hold up some signs and try to be a witness. And the question has been, well, what changed? After we did all of that, what changed? I keep saying we changed, right? Like our interior spiritual life changed. We showed God that we care about our neighbor. We showed our neighbors that we care about our neighbors. We show the people driving by, and I try to look as clergy and pastorally and as white privileged as possible while standing on the corner, because I want everyone to see it's accessible. But leadership in the church is, we care about these things. People who claim to follow Jesus, who claim to love God, love our neighbor, and love our enemy in that discipleship following, we are going to do this for ourselves and for our neighbor. And I think so much of how if I were a refugee from Syria, if I had children caged at the border, if I have, as I do, if I'm a mother with children of color and black daughters and a Asian American husband, if I'm in those situations, I want to know that the brothers and sisters in Christ care, that they care about me and they care about my family. So when we stand on the corner together, we're trying to put that justice and love on display. We're respectful, we're kind, we're following in the footsteps of the last several thousand years, but particularly the last 300 years of our country of trying to stand up for these things. And I'm hopeful that, yes, as the children are there with us, that they're watching, that this is what not just what justice looks like. It's what discipleship looks like. It's what Christianity looks like. It's that love looks like this when we stand with one another and we listen to one another, and we can go to bed at night knowing that we're the kind of people who are going to stand with our brothers and sisters as they suffer and cry out with them for justice and pursue justice in all of the very important systemic ways that are not only performative, right? But that is one of the ways in which we are trying to demonstrate our worship with our whole self. But that's not where it begins or ends. It's just one of the many things that we're doing as individuals and as a church. I think the other thing that has happened for us, we've been really grateful for, is that there have been people who have felt disenfranchised by the church, not included, either persons of color or just persons of conviction. And they are looking for a faith community, a Jesus-centered, inspiring people in the way of Jesus community where they can express themselves in this way. So to see us do that lets them know that we're here and we've found one another, and that's been a good gift. Not everybody loves it. That's okay too. We feel called to do this for right now.
Could I just note, as far as speaking to younger people, that, shortly after George Floyd's death, it was kind of like a national movement. Everyone, kind of like it was huge. It captured the nation's attention. So I think what speaks to like the church still saying we're going to do this after it has been like it's after it's popular, because I think there's clearly on a national level some of the movement has not so much as it's died down, but some of the crowd has died down. That the fact that there is a church still carrying the manner 10, 12 weeks after it was popular, that they're still doing it and doing it in community, speaks a lot, and that resonates deeply, because that means that the fight becomes beyond just this enraged moment, but it's really just a long enduring ethic, as it has already been stated, of who we are and who the church is. So just that it's very powerful that a church is still able to be like, hey, long after everybody else put their signs down, we still got ours up, because this is just who we are.
Amen. Thanks, Pastor Marcus. I'm going to turn it over to John. He's going to lead us in a close here. And thank you all so much for being here with us, and to all still listening on and pursuing justice. Thank you for being part of the conversation and wrestling with all the texts and the subject with us. We're grateful.
Yeah, this is fantastic. I think we were sharing over Facebook and YouTube Live that really felt that this type of engagement is incredibly necessary. And so to hear that the conversation will continue is something that I know that I'm a fan of. I know a lot of other people will want to look into resources that you've mentioned today, will want to look into Spark and how they can participate alongside you, especially knowing that a lot of things are still shelter in place and online. And so, but there's also a lot of people in this area that might have a fresh ignited fire for gospel justice through this session. And so I would love to turn it over to you and ask everybody if there was a call to action, an immediate call to action that was something that you wanted people to do to participate with you all, some adventure to invite them on, some opportunity to come alongside. What would that be in short? Maybe we can go around. Everybody could just say, one thing. You've all mentioned a lot of things, great resources to check out, great steps to do. But if there's a final closing thought that you all would like to share.
So thank you, John, for that question. I'm going to go back to something Tom mentioned that I think is really critical at this juncture. When white people or people of privilege learn about this and want to do something, that can actually be quite dangerous. Because what happens is, depending upon how far along the journey you've been, there is so much work that needs to be done. For example, we didn't even go into what privilege is, what fragility is, what white supremacy is, right? There's so much. And what Tom mentioned was awareness, and then activism. Allies, right. Yeah. So awareness, allies, and then activism and advocacy. And what we have found and what I have sensed is that white people or people who are in positions of privilege within a society want to immediately jump to advocacy. Why? Because they are comfortable and are familiar with being in positions of power to be able to do something. And so what may actually be the most important thing is to not do anything and to submit yourself under the leadership and the education of people of color, of Black voices, and to do that for a couple years before you, and that doesn't mean I shouldn't say you do nothing, but the primary avenue for people who have been in positions of privilege and power is to humble yourself. Blessed are those who are meek, right? And, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And so to humble yourself. So for me, the avenue is always reading and watching YouTube books, and then sitting down and having coffee and learning from somebody, those kinds of areas. It is only from that particular position can your advocacy then actually become effective. Because if you don't do the hard work of those first steps, it can be really challenging. We didn't even talk about being uncomfortable. Like Melody Hobson has an amazing TED Talk on needing to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And that's something that a lot of people in positions of privilege are not used to. And it's really difficult to learn how to be on the uncomfortable side where you've made a lot of mistakes, where you don't know everything, where you have to learn from somebody else. You know, that can be really, really hard for some folks. So my opening salvo and contribution to your wonderful question is, think very carefully. Are you actually in a position of being able to do something, or maybe you just need to learn? Have you actually read Stamped from the Beginning, or Divided by Faith, or Color Compromise, or I'm Still Here? You know, that's like 101, step 101. Just pick up a bunch of books to read. Stacy's phenomenal at curating all these voices on social media, because I'm not on social media. I don't know anything about that, but Stacy can help you with that, right? And then get connected and just slowly start to learn. So I'm belaboring the point, but I think there.
To hammer home what Kevin's saying is that also it is a spiritual journey. So the biggest thing that I think people make the mistake of is that, like, you know, you want to jump to point D, but don't want to go through steps B, C, and we're talking about a spiritual journey. Understand that even amongst those of us in the Black community who've had to live with this for a long time, you know, like, sometimes we're at like, depending on where you are, we're, again stated, master's level, where you still might be in first grade, you know, and give yourself patience and get upset, get angry, go through the guilt, because we're talking levels, not, you know what I'm saying, not progression. Like, you go through the process. And if you go through the process, you will be perfectly fine, and you will see, man, you will be able to identify with Jesus. I find an irony in that I think that Black descendants of slaves have always been able to connect with Jesus. We've always been able to connect with the story of people living underneath Roman oppression, facing injustice, and then yet to move through that with grace and humility, to forgive and love. Jesus is always connected with us, but like Frederick Douglass and many of the abolitionists point out, Jesus, you know, like, we've always seen this kind of disconnect between this religion or Jesus you've taught to us versus the one we actually connect with as a community and individually. So just allow yourself to spiritually grow.
I would add, find a community, hopefully a Christian community, where you can go through the very personal and collective journey of understanding your own racial identity and understanding how other people's racial identities have impacted them. Actually, all of us here on this call were part of a group that met for weeks. It was actually between two books. So we didn't have material to read. We were the material. And we shared so openly and so vulnerably. It was the most intense Christian small group I've ever been part of. But now when we are standing out there on El Camino, I know Marcus sees me and Pamela sees me, and they know what I'm about. They know what I've confessed to in my life. They know the ways that I'm trying to relinquish power. They know the ways that I understand my own biracial identity. And so when I'm holding a sign that says Black Lives Matter, and I see my Black Christian brother and sister, they know that I have done the work. I'm not just paying lip service to it. So I encourage you to have really honest, vulnerable conversations in the way that Christians are often trained to do about, you know, personal sin and all these other things that racism is sinful too. And we can confess the blunders we've made or the ignorance that we've had for years in really holy ways. And another thing I would just encourage people that justice movements can always use your money, even if you're still learning. So research ways that you can support people who are really doing the work that you may not feel ready to do yet, because money means something in our world right now.
And I would add, if you're going to church and the sermons are talking about racism and white supremacy and how horrific that is, you're in a good church. If you're in a church where they're not talking about it ever, you may want to talk to that pastor, because it's important. It's the context of today, and we live here today as Christians, and we need to be able to speak into it.
Pamela, I wanted to give you the opportunity to contribute any next steps that you might recommend for people starting the journey, if you'd like.
I would just say keep pushing on what you know, what you think you know. Keep open to the discovery process and connecting with others around you. Make yourself an advocate and befriend people around you. I think this is a community thing, and it's a lasting thing. So as Stacy said, part of the work is standing up and doing the work and being available, doing the reading, being out there and participating. That shows that you're in it, that you've taken this to heart. It's living out the way of Jesus, right? It's putting your feet where your mouth is and doing the work, just continuing to move forward. So, and I'm super encouraged by this conversation and all the people that are a part of it, because it gives hope. It gives hope in places where you would tend to give up hope and frustrations and all of that. So continue to push.
Thank you, Pamela. I really appreciate that. I want to thank all of you, and thank you, John, and the entire Passion Talk team for your hospitality and your invitation for us to come and share a little bit about what we've been up to. I want to note that as Stacy was sharing, we had been all part of a racial reconciliation group for a long time, and I just want to say, like, as one of the white pastors in the room, I was not the leader of that group. And it was important that I was not the leader of that group, nor was Pastor Kevin the leader of the group. The group met in our home, but we did not lead the group. And so if you are Caucasian and you are the pastor and the leader of your church, I want to encourage you to center voices other than yourself and to try to find places. And that's not to say go start to enlist any person of color in your community and force them to lead it. But the way that you can center other people is there are, as Stacey has mentioned, lots of authors and this is what they do for a living. You can hire them, you can pay them a good fee. They can come in and lead their book club for you, their group for you, or it's already available for you online. And so you can center other voices without having to either go broke if you don't have those financial resources. There's ways to do it just free online. Dr. Kendi's constantly leading book clubs, within the communities and all around the US. And I think you can find those other resources, but also start to just sit back and listen and spend a long time listening. As Pastor Kevin said, there can be a lot of damage if the first thing we do is jump on in and flex all of our pastoral leadership muscles that we're accustomed to flexing. We need to sit and wait and listen. Pastor Marcus, thank you for reminding us that this is a spiritual journey. Racism is a sin. The Bible calls it out. The Bible tries to give us systemic responses to it, right? We need to confess of that sin and then try to do that work where we have places that we need to do the work ourselves, and then places where we've contributed or benefited from those systems of privilege, and then try to start to do the hard work of seeing justice come in those places. So for all of that, I want to thank you guys for being partners for the gospel, for the good news of Jesus Christ in our church and in our community at large. Thank you for continuing to teach me, lead me, and help all of us grow at Spark. And thank you again, John, for your time in the platform this afternoon. And God bless everyone who's listening as we pursue the way of Jesus.